Hey biology, so today we're going to go ahead and talk about classification of living things. This is chapter 18.1 and 18.2 notes. So if you remember, the total of all the living things in an ecosystem is the biodiversity. And then a species is a population of organisms that share similar characteristics and can breed with each other and produce viable offspring. So biologists have identified and named over 1.5 million species. I actually had a professor in college that found a bug in the rainforest and was able to name that bug. So there's still 2 to 100 million species yet to be discovered. So either those that are in like the deep ocean trenches or those not discovered in rainforests yet. So why do we classify organisms? Well, first of all, it identifies and names organisms so that when we're talking about an organism, we know what we're talking about. It also helps us group organisms in logical ways. So taxonomy is the branch of biology that names and groups organisms. Naming and organizing animals into groups with biological significance helps make sense of relationships. So birds are related to what and so forth. So birds, an animal with feathers, you know that. And so naming organisms helps us understand what we're talking about. A good classification system places organisms in a group with other organisms that are similar. So obviously we have fish. Those are all organisms that we find underwater. They have, they're cold-blooded and so forth. So that's our fish. A good classification system uses names that are unique, can change as new data is discovered, and shows relationships of organisms. So the first person to classify organisms was the Greek teacher and philosopher Aristotle more than 2,000 years ago. Now Aristotle's system was pretty simple. You were either plants or animals. And plants were based off the size of their stem. Animals were based off where they lived. Common names can vary, and so basically he just gave organism common names. So an example of ways that common names can vary is the puma, cat, mountain lion, cougar. They're all the same names, or they're all different names for the same animal. So if we have different names for the same animal, it kind of confuses the world, and we don't know if we're talking about the same thing. And so, again, common names can vary. We have the chipmunk. In German, this is the Streifenhörnchen. I don't even know German students. You'll have to correct me if I was wrong there. Tamia in Italian, Ardilla, Listata in Spanish. So even in different languages, they vary. They can also be misleading. So a jellyfish isn't a fish, but a seahorse is. A sea cucumber sounds like a plant, but it's actually an animal. So common names aren't usually the best way to describe an organism or talk about an organism when we're doing it scientifically. So in the United Kingdom, a buzzard refers to a hawk, but in the United States, a buzzard refers to a vulture. So by the mid-19th century, scientists recognized that using common names was confusing, and they agreed to using Latin and Greek to give a single name to each species. So example of red oak, the Quercus folius obtuse senatus, you get what I mean. So oak with deeply divided leaves with deep blunt lobes bearing hair-like bristles. Okay, what's the problem with this word? Well, basically, I could barely even say it. Second of all, it's way too long and too hard to remember. No one's going to remember this. And so different scientists also describe things differently. So we can't just use Latin and Greek to describe the entire organism. We have to come up with a better system to do that. And so Carlos Linnaeus came to the rescue. He was a Swedish botanist, and he devised a classification system that we still use today. So Linnaeus' system, he grouped organisms into 7 different taxonomic levels, or we call them taxons. Each organism has a 2-part scientific name. So that 2-part scientific name we call binomial nomenclature. So the bi in binomial means 2, and then nomial means name and so forth. So it's a 2-part name. So this is basically how he organized groups. He had kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. You do have to know that order, so make sure that you remember that. So kingdom await a mnemonic device you can use. You can use kids prefer cheese over fried green spinach. That might be a way to remember. I know when I was in high school, I learned King Philip came over for good spaghetti. It's just something to remember it by. So you want to remember the order in which Linnaeus' system works. Okay, so here's just an example of Linnaeus' system working for a line. So we have the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Carnivora, family Fidele, genus Panthera, and species Leo. So when we look at Linnaeus' system, the kingdom encompasses the most amount of organisms. So obviously you and I are part of the Animalia kingdom. We're part of the phylum, and the phylum then begins to be more specific. So Chordata, we are part of this phylum with them. We're part of the same class as them as well. And so basically, as you go through Linnaeus' system from kingdom to species, you tend, or not tend, but you get more specific. Now, in binomial nomenclature, the scientific name has basically a two-name naming system. The first name is always the genus name, and we always capitalize it. The second name is always the species name, and it's always lowercase. Both of these are going to be underlined, and then we're going to capitalize the genus and lowercase the species. So here's an example of just different types of bears. They have the same genus, but they belong to different species. So the species is unique to that bear. And then, of course, our name, the humans, we are Homo sapiens. So we have the capitalization for the genus and the lowercase for the species. It's either italicized or underlined. Okay, biology. So now we're going to go ahead and talk about Chapter 18.2, modern evolutionary classification. So in a way, organisms determine who belongs to their species by choosing whom they will mate with. Taxonomic groups are invented by scientists to group organisms with similar characteristics. But what characteristics are more important? Or most important? So we know that like cats and crocodiles, they both have sharp teeth, but do we group them together because of their sharp teeth, or do we find different characteristics? So should a dolphin be grouped with a fish because it has fins and lives in water, or with mammals because it breathes air and makes milk for its young? So to do this, we'll use this example of a crab, barnacle, and limpet. When you just look at these organisms, you would say that a limpet and a barnacle look the most similar, but looks can be deceiving. So limpet and barnacle larvae, they're very different. Barnacles have jointed limbs, they have segmented bodies, they have exoskeletons, however limpets do not. When we look more closely, crabs and barnacle larvae are very similar. Barnacles have jointed limbs, they have segmented bodies, exoskeletons, well, so do crabs. So when we look at the limpets, we actually find that their internal anatomy is more like a snail, which are mollusks. And so we would characterize limpets more as mollusks than we would as the barnacle. So classification just on visibilities or similarities, you would pretty much match up the barnacle and limpet, and the crab would be an outlier. However, if we look at a cladogram and we match them up based on features that they have in common, like molted skeleton, segmentation, and their derived characteristics, we would most likely group the crab and the barnacle, and the limpet would be the one that's least like the others. So modern taxonomy, where we group organisms based on their evolutionary history, we call evolutionary classification. So the study of organisms' evolutionary history is modern taxonomy, and we would call that phylogeny. So cladistics is a system of classifying organisms that are considered only characteristics that are new evolutionary innovations. So characteristics that appear in recent parts of a lineage but not in older members are called derived characteristics. So derived characteristics can be used to construct a diagram that shows evolutionary relationships, which you guys have already built. We call those cladograms. So derived characters appear at branches of the cladogram, showing where they first arose. So basically we see that the tiny free-swimming larva is the derived characteristic of both limpet and crab and barnacle. And basically after that point they separate because then segmentation and molted skeleton make the crab and barnacle, are the derived characteristics of just the crab and barnacle, but not of the limpet. So cladograms help scientists understand how one lineage is going to branch from another. All classification methods discussed so far are based on physical similarities and differences. Even organisms with very different anatomies can share common traits. So, an example, all living things use DNA and RNA to pass on information and control growth. So genes of many organisms show remarkable similarities at the molecular level. So similarities in DNA can be used to help determine classification and evolutionary relationships between organisms. So humans have a gene that codes for the protein that helps our muscles move called myosin. Researchers have found a gene in yeast that codes for a myosin protein that enables internal cell parts to move. So yeast and we make basically the same protein. So we're more similar than what we would have thought we are based on our physical features. So here's just an example of the number of differences that we see in organisms, the number of differences we see in hemoglobin polypeptide. And so the more differences that we see, the more different we are going to be from an organism. So we have amino acids different in a rhesus monkey, so we're more closely related than to the lamprey. So similarities in DNA can be used to help show evolutionary relationships and how species have changed. Traditionally, these first two, the African vulture and the American vulture, were classified together in a falcon family, and storks were in a separate family. And when you look at them, like, that would make sense. Just based on looks, they wouldn't be classified together. American vultures have a particular behavior, which is pretty interesting. When they get overheated, they urinate on their legs to cool off. The only other bird that does that is the stork. When we compared DNA, it showed us that there are more similarities between the American vulture and the stork than from the DNA of the two vultures, suggesting a more recent common ancestor between storks and the American vulture. And that's just it for 18.2.